The major problem with battling overfishing in the high seas is that it's difficult to track vessels due to the lack of transparency of the vessel registration. And you're probably like, Andrew, what does that mean? We're going to get into it in today's episode, but essentially what happens is if a ship wants to fish and they overfish or they do illegal fishing, they can get away with it by re-registering the vessel in different countries. And that's the major issue of what's going on. We don't have that list of ships where they've registered before, what flag they're bearing, and things like that. And that makes it really difficult to track. But the results of a new study is hoping to change this problem by creating a global database to track the global fishing fleet that can help tackle illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. That's IUU fishing. Analysis of the data found that 20% of the high seas fishing is likely unregulated, and that reflagging of vessels, which I'll explain in the episode, mainly occurred in East Asia, West Africa, or Eastern Europe. The researchers plan on making the dataset publicly available so that authorities have access to timely information. And what I'm going to tell you is this is huge. This is going to help enforce illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. We're going to talk about that on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening in the ocean, what you can do to speak up for the ocean, and how you can live for a better ocean by taking action. And I'm just going to just say one little thing. If I mess up on saying how to protect the ocean for the podcast name, it's because I recently changed it, and it's very difficult to get in a new habit. I've been able to say Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast for a long time. When I changed it from Speak Up for Blue podcast to the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast, for a keyword there, it took me a long time to figure that out and get used to saying that. So changing the name completely to How to Protect the Ocean, one was a great move because I'm looking at my stats, and my stats have essentially doubled from what it was last month, based on keywords and maybe a bit of a more directional podcast title. But it also it's reflective of what we do on this podcast. So it's just going to take me a little while, so I might stutter over the name, or I might just trip over the name and see what I can do. But I'll get better. I promise. As everything goes on, I will get better. But thanks again for joining us. We appreciate you listening. This is a podcast I've been doing since 2015, and I've talked a lot about overfishing. And I remember specifically a story of an original vessel that was a Russian vessel that had been chased for decades because of its unruly fishing practices. It was a vessel that had not only partaken in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing for each time it was there, but it was hard to track. Why was it hard to track? Because every time it got caught, or every time it was identified under one flag, it changed the flag, or it changed the name of the vessel. And then when they finally caught the vessel, or they finally got a hold of it, they had trouble finding out who owned it, because there's so many subsidiary companies that were owning it, and it got transferred so many times. It was very difficult to track it back to the original owner, or the current owner for that matter. And that has to do with transparency. It's very difficult for people to be transparent, and that or for authorities to understand the transparency, or to see the transparency of the vessel. How often has it switched owners? How often has it switched flags? And you're probably wondering, well, what does that mean? Well, owners is the owner of the vessel. Who owns the vessel? Who is going out and paying the crew to go out and grab the fish? Who's getting the money for selling the fish? All that kind of stuff. That's the owner. That's a pretty, easy thing to explain. But when we're talking about the flags, is each vessel in the ocean is registered, or actually each vessel is registered to a country, and usually it's the country of origin. But when we talk about international fisheries, you can register your boat in any country. And every country has different sort of different rules and regulations based on fishing. So some are a little bit more strict, and others are not so much, or they don't track things. And so the flag that you fly under, the flag that you sail under, I should say, is reflective on how strict the policies are, on fishing and the regulations. So, you can change a vessel from Turkey to France to Britain to Indonesia to anywhere, right? Pretty much anywhere. But this study that we're going to be talking about, by the way, I found this article in Manga Bay News. And if you go to mangabay.com, you'll be able to find it. And I'll put a link directly to the article in the show notes. But this one reveals information about the shifting identities of the global fishing fleet, which can help tackle illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. The research combines a decade's worth of satellite vessel tracking data and with identification information from more than 40 public registries to generate a first-of-its-kind global assessment of fishing compliance, foreign ownership of vessels, and reflagging. And you're probably banging your head against the wall and be like, why is this first of its kind? Why didn't we have this before? Databases have been around forever. We've always had it. And now with programs like Excel and what's the other one? All these databases, I can't even think. There's all these databases around, right? Access database, there's Oracle databases. Every company has a database, and you can put it in there. You can put information in there. It's wonderful. It's handy. And we've been tracking locations of vessels with their names for, decades. And so why is this new? Why are we just learning about this now and just doing it now? Why hasn't anybody done it before? Because nobody cared as much, is what I'm thinking. I don't know if that's the real reason, but it's what I'm thinking, right? And so the fact is now we can track these vessels who are very slippery. No pun intended, because they're in water, but they're very slippery. And so this is a very important study. This is because it's not only just a study of being like, hey, we need to do this. It's, hey, we've done this. We've started this for you guys. And the researchers plan on making a broader data set publicly available soon and regularly updating this data so that authorities have access to timely information. Meaning that if a ship comes into their ports, they can track the history of that ship and track whether they were ever a part of IUU fishing, right? The illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. Because it's so easy to just change your registration country. It's so easy to change the name of a boat. Sometimes they do it like in the ocean, while they're sailing. They can change the name of the boat. And it really wasn't until the enforcement got better that we realized that this was happening. And that story, going back to that story of that ship that was, chased around, it was chased around by different authorities. But once it went out of the exclusive economic zone of that country, it was in the high seas. So a lot of the coast guards of those countries couldn't go past those borders. But then you had places like the Sea Shepherd organization that would have their enforcement boats, and they were, for over the last 10 years, they've been, and I think maybe more, I'm not sure, they've been tracking illegal boats that are partaking in IUU fishing, and they've been chasing them down. They don't just track them; they chase them down. And it, people, the fishing vessels hate them because they just won't. They're relentless. They just won't go away. But it's people are like, well, how come this is new? Well, we've been tracking ships. Every ship that sails from a country has to be tracked, and they use what's called AIS, and that's a way of tracking vessels, and I think it's called that because what's the acronym? I'm looking over here what the acronym is. I can't find what the acronym. I believe it's Automated Information System. I think it's that. I'm not sure. Let me just do Command F AIS. It's Automatic Identification System. Sorry, Automatic Identification System. And essentially what happens with this AIS is it's a GPS system. And so you can track, for every certain amount of movement, whatever the interval is of when it pings the satellite, you could track where they've gone. Now, that could be shut off if they really wanted to. And they can just say, oh, well, it stopped working. We noticed it stopped working. We turned it back on. So a lot of AIS vessels will turn the AIS machine off, the tracker off, when they are in like a marine protected area fishing. And then you can't detect whether they're in there, or people know because they'll turn it off right before they go on the boundary, and they'll turn it on. They're on the other side, or they're somewhere else. But it's different. Let's just say. There's also the vessel monitoring system, VMS, which is required for vessels longer than 24 meters or 79 feet. But only some countries will publicly release this information. Even the AIS information. I worked with AIS information when I contracted with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And I wasn't allowed to share that information. I wasn't allowed to give that information. It wasn't publicly available. The Coast Guard had that, and they were sworn to secrecy. They weren't allowed to share it. They were only allowed to share. We had to put in a special agreement, and that was just to find out where the shipping lanes are, so that we can do better management for coastal management. So that was, that's always interesting. But, the tracking is not foolproof, as I mentioned earlier. And so having the VMS, the AIS, they're great tools, but they're not perfect, and we need more. And because we couldn't track the history of a vessel in terms of who owned it, which company owns it, what subsidiary owns it, because what was happening is an owner would have a ship. They would buy a ship, maybe a fleet of ships, and they would go out and they would do overfishing, illegal fishing. And so they would come back, and then people are like, wait a minute, I'm starting to get to know this vessel a little bit, or this fleet a little bit, and I don't think they're good. So the owner would be like, okay, fine, I'm going to sell it to a different company, but I'm still going to own it in some kind of capacity. I'm going to change the name of it, and I'm also going to change the flag it sails under. So instead of sailing under Turkey, I'm going to let it sail under Ghana. Okay, great. Now, because we couldn't track where it was before, nobody knew which vessel it was. It was completely different. They may have given it a new paint job, and nobody would have known the difference. They put it in a new country, sail it under a new country, and boom, new vessel doing the same thing as it did in the country across the world. Kind of difficult to track, isn't it? So when you're able to trace the ownership, the history of the ownership, it makes it a lot easier to do something about it, right? It makes it a lot easier for a country to spot a vessel and go to the history. It's like a car nowadays, or an SUV or a truck. When a police woman or person, comes across a car or a truck and they think there's something suspicious, or they pull it over for some reason, they'll check the plates. The plates are the identification. It's like the flag it flies under. That plate brings up information on the owner of the vehicle, the history of the vehicle, right? Who owned it? Maybe who owned it before. That I don't know, but it has information on the driver, the person, the license of the driver who owns it, who's on the registration papers, right? And they can track that with that name. They can go in and they can track like how many tickets have they had in the past, and what's their driver record like, and all that kind of stuff. Well, wouldn't that be nice to do with fishing vessels? Because we haven't been able to do that with fishing vessels at this point. So fishing vessels, like I said, can do something wrong. They can go out and do IUU fishing, and they can come back to a port, and somebody's like, I suspect that to be something. And the owner's like, okay, fine. We're going to change the name. We're going to change the flag it sails under, and we're going to give it a nice paint job. And nobody will know the difference. Nobody will know the difference. And then we're going to go back out and do the exact same thing. And then, somebody's on to us. Let's do the exact same thing again. And then by that time, if they do catch the boat doing something wrong, they seize it. They may seize whatever it has at that time. And then when they go back and they try and find the history, they can't find the history, or they try and find the company who owns it, but it's a subsidiary and you don't know who owns that subsidiary because it's gone through so many hands and through other companies. And it's a mess to try and enforce and to try and get somebody to pay the price of the illegal fishing. So you see how this paperwork, this non-trail of paperwork affects overfishing, and how it allows overfishing to happen so easily. Now with this transparency tool where you have the history of those ships and it's constantly updated, we'll see how long that happens, but it's constantly updated. This is something that's absolutely necessary To control overfishing, you have to be able to punish the people who are, engaging in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And if you don't, you will never stop it. And to enforce it, you have to know the ship, you have to know the owner. And if you continue to allow that to be switched, you're not going to stop anything. It's going to continue to happen. So this study, although seems normal, and being like, why hasn't this happened before? Well, it's happening now. And we should be happy for it. This could be something that's really important. And I always like this kind of study because it's applicable. It has real world implications. We need to protect our fish in the high seas. It's really hard to track. Well, boats are registered to certain countries and they need to pay for those if they do something wrong. They need to pay the price. Justice needs to be served. That will hopefully reduce the amount of vessels that are going to be overfishing. Right? Now, there are other ways to battle it as well, because it's not easy. Right? You still have to prove that this boat was overfishing or is over the quota. Other than catching them red-handed with, fish in there, and the type of fish and all that kind of stuff, you have to find it. You have to track it. The AIS works, but, you're not always going to be there. You're not always going to have a Coast Guard vessel on the high seas. You'll never have that. You're not always going to have a Sea Shepherd vessel ready to pounce on any criminal or any criminal activity. It's not always there. The ocean is a massive place, and we just do not have enough ships to be able to enforce it all. Satellite imagery can help. AIS can help. It's a tool. But the things that can really help are policies like the European Union started to implement a number of years ago, where they started to give yellow cards and red cards and green cards for countries depending on how they enforce their IUU fishing policies. So if they were able to say, hey, Vietnam isn't really pressing down on IUU fishing, and we know this, well, we're not going to buy from them. And they rely on us buying, the EU buying their fish. It's like something like 50%. So the fact that they're saying, no, you get a yellow card as a warning, we're not going to take as much, or you get a red card, we're not going to take any. That is a big, huge blow to like a country like Vietnam. So Vietnam's going to turn around and say, okay, we're going to start putting policies into place. It's kind of a way to force them to put policies into place. And EU feels better because they know they're getting more sustainable fish and not overfished fish, right? Other countries have had some bad raps. Thailand or Taiwan. So you get a lot of countries who are part of that, and it'll go up and down depending on the government, depending on the policies and policy changes. But the ones that abide by the policies, the ones that enforce, anti-IUU fishing, will be the victors and have the more money. Will have the more sales because the places like the EU, Canada, US, Australia, Britain or England or the UK will buy fish. They import lots of fish. And so they're going to go for those countries. But they also have to make sure, they have an ethical duty to make sure that they aren't buying fish from, IUU fishing. Because the citizens of Canada, the US, and all those countries, they don't want to have that. We don't want that. We want sustainably fished fish and seafood. So having policies like that can help other countries kind of abide by the rules or abide by the latest science and management, whether they want to or not. If they want to make money and they want to bring in that money, they're going to have to. So it's a bit of a control and probably not the best way to do things, but it helps. It's one of those management tools that helps. It's a tool in the conservation tool belt, as I like to call it. And many other scientists, of course. But that's the story, and I really like this story. It's frustrating the fact that it's only happening now, but it also takes a lot of work. I can see an entire organization built off of this. Just maintaining the database and making sure that information is correct. That's not an easy thing to do. It's a lot of work, A lot of connections, a lot of collaborations, and it needs to be done. It needs to be followed up with, and it needs to be maintained. So that's the story for today. I would love to hear what you think about this episode. You can DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean, the @ sign. Or you can email me if you go to speakupforblue.com and just click on the contact us. That goes to my personal email when you fill in that form. It goes to my personal email. I'd love to hear from you, what you think of this episode, the podcast in general, whatever you want to talk about. If you want me to cover certain stories, I'd be more than happy to. It might take a while to do it, but I'd be more than happy to. But that's it for today's episode. So thank you so much for listening and listening to my voice that I keep losing. I did record 2 in a row today, so that's going to be taxing. So I hope it's not too distracting. But thank you so much for listening to this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.